the second page, you'll see it between lines 46 and 56, the removal of the sunset provision. The reason for that is, as you know, bonds are generally 10, 15, 20 years. If they want to refinance, remodel, expand that facility, they need the capacity to be able to do that. And from my constituents' perspective, if they want to continue it to be on the hotel motel tax, not in the general fund. So it's a very simple local proposition that has to be done by a general statute.
Are there questions? What's the pleasure of the committee? Motion second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Passes on to rules. It's 303.
You are amazing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Next is House Bill 694. Vice Chairman Harrell, from your seat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 694 makes a minor change in that it requires our motor fuel vendors to file their monthly reports electronically with the Department of Revenue. Currently, only those that have a liability of $500 or more are required to file electronically. Many of these taxpayers sell millions of gallons of gas in tax-exempt or prepaid status, so they have no liability, and therefore they're not required to file electronically. This would simply make them file electronically.
Are there questions? What's the pleasure of the committee? The motion is second to pass. Any discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Passes on to rules. All right, next we have House Resolution 158. This is my bill, so I'm going to ask Representative Rutledge, if he will, to chair on this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Resolution 158.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is sort of an evolution of something that I've been presenting for the last 7 or 8 years, but it specifically deals with dedicated fees, and we have several fees under Georgia law now: Solid Waste Trust Fund, Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, Joshua's Law, which is a driver's education program, and several others that are dedicated by statute. They are trust funds. They are supposed to be used for a particular purpose. For instance, the Solid Waste Trust Funds to be used for tire recycling, environmental education, those kinds of things. Joshua's Law is a fine add-on that is supposed to be used for driver education. Hazardous Waste Trust Fund is an add-on to the tipping fee at landfills that is to be used for monitoring unlined landfills and closed landfills and cleaning up hazardous waste sites. And all of those by statute are dedicated for a particular purpose. Unfortunately, under the Georgia Constitution, the only way that you can constitutionally dedicate funds is if it is in the Constitution. You cannot, by statute, one legislative body cannot tie the hands of another legislative body. And so rather than to put solid waste, hazardous waste, Joshua's Law, or any of these other things in the Constitution, which is a cumbersome process, and if you ever get it in there, you can't get it out, or it's very difficult to get it out. What I was looking for was an in-between process which would constitutionally allow us by statute to dedicate, and that's what this proposed constitutional amendment does. And it basically says that if this constitutional amendment passes, that then the legislature could constitutionally, by statute, dedicate fees to a particular purpose, provided that the bill that dedicates those fees passes by a 2/3 majority, that it refers specifically to this constitutional provision, saying that it's passed in accordance with the terms and conditions of that provision, that it sunsets with at least no more than 10 years, and that it cannot be changed or further dedicated unless by 2/3 of a vote, but it can be repealed by a majority vote. It can be in times of financial emergency, like we found out during the Great Recession of 2009, 10, 11, 12, that era. that if we have a financial emergency that is declared by the governor, that upon resolution of a majority vote in both houses, the House and the Senate, that it can be suspended for up to 2 years, and those funds then could be redirected to another purpose during that period of time, that during any such period or 10-year period before the sunset, that there could be up to 3 of those emergencies. So 6 out of 10 years, if there were a financial emergency, we could, rather than having to close schools and yet we're still, recycling tires or whatever it is, we could redirect those monies up to 3 times for a 2-year period of each time during a particular 10-year period. And so anyway, there's safeguards in there. There's also a 1% of the budget that is the maximum that can be dedicated. We don't want to put ourselves in the hand of having in the position where we've got so much of dedicated monies that we really do not have the discretion to appropriate like we need to do. So there's a limitation in this constitutional amendment of no more than 1% of the budgeted amount can be at any time dedicated. So that's sort of the outlines of the constitutional amendment. If it passes out of this committee, it'd go to rules, and it would go to the House floor. It'd have to pass by a 2/3 majority and go to the Senate, and likewise, and then it would be put on the ballot for the fall election cycle for the voters to vote on. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from members? 24.
Find you another mic.
23.
It was. It keeps going off.
It's on. No, when you click it one more time, and don't touch it again.
Is that on?
It's on.
Got it.
Good
James,
instructions.
Mr. Chairman, if this were to pass, and I think we do need to make sure for the public's peace of mind that we are spending funds in the direction that it was intended, and I think that's the intent of your constitutional amendment. What is the effective date that this would take place, assuming that it passes the voters? When would this take effect? Would it take effect January 1st of 2019 for going forward, or? Or would it start July 1st?
Well, if it went to the voters, it would go to the voters in November. So my understanding is it would be January 1. That's what Legislative Council says.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any other questions?
Do we know what the existing fees, what dollar amounts are we looking at now?
Well, I mean, first of all, nothing that we have now would be covered under this. In other words, if you wanted to make solid waste or hazardous waste or Joshua's Law or any of the transportation fees that are currently in effect, subject to this, you would have to amend them and make them comply with this. In other words, you would amend solid waste by putting in a provision that this bill is passed pursuant to constitutional provision, so and so and so and so. It would then have to have a 10-year or less sunset placed in it, and it would have to pass both houses by a 2/3 majority before it could be constitutionally dedicated. So it's not going to retroactively capture anything. So you would start counting based on whatever legislation was passed going forward.
Gotcha. Makes sense. You have a question?
Yes, sir.
23.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very much supportive of the bill. I'm looking down the road, and as we get to a situation, just maybe use an example, the tire disposal fee. It's coming to a point where people are using these tires, not just to whitewash them and put them in the yard anymore, but to have them cut up and made into other products so that there's a market for used tires. And if that were the case, and we no longer had the need to handle with a fear of the disposal being something the state has to take care of, how would we do away with the fee if that were down the road? Another example may be as we get to automated cars, and now we no longer have a need to go through driver's education. Just thinking maybe beyond the point of what reality is, but still, if there drops the need of the continuing purpose of the fee, how will the legislature have the
Well,
capacity to stop that?
the beauty of this, as opposed to if we constitutionally dedicated it, is then you would have to amend the Constitution. So that's why we're trying to find an in-between kind of way to do it. But with a 10-year sunset, that every 10 years you are required to look at it or before you can extend it. But the other thing that I didn't bring up that the constitutional amendment requires is that every year the legislature is supposed to be furnished with a report on how much money was collected and how much money was expended. So at any time during that 10-year period, if the legislature found out that, for instance, $10 million had been collected in solid waste trust fund, but only $4 million had been appropriated, and therefore $6 million remained in the trust fund, then the legislature could say, why is this happening? And if it's happening because of the fact that there are less cost to monitoring landfills or there are less costs for that, then the legislature could either amend the legislation, because we can do it with a 2/3 majority. We could rescind the legislation, which we can do by a majority vote, or we could reduce the amount of the fee to match the, with a 2/3 majority, we could reduce the amount of fee to match what we are actually spending. So it gives us the flexibility to do that in the legislature without having to further amend the Constitution.
So the main thing we're doing was stopping the ability of these funds going as a general fund disbursement.
That is correct.
They're dedicated, but we can change the amount of the fees by just regular legislation from time to time if that were necessary, and in fact do away with the fee because there's no longer a need for it.
Precisely.
Thank you. Good move.
All right, anyone else have any questions? Make your motion. Have a do pass in a second. All in favor? All opposed?
We are adjourned.